Welcome to Christ the Lord Clearwater's weekly message. I'm Pastor John Backus here in our studio in Clearwater, Florida, where we share the good news of Jesus on the Gulf Coast. We're beginning a new series for the season of Lent called Crushed. Jesus crushes those things which could crush us. Some years ago, Bob and Joan were driving on a local street when Bob suddenly began to feel like he was being crushed. He was having a heart attack. As his chest got tighter, he lost control of the vehicle, and the car was crushed as it crashed into a utility pole off the side of the road. Bob didn't survive the crash or the heart attack, leaving his wife, Joan, crushed with the grief of being a widower. Many things can crush us, like a load of guilt or regret or grief. In this series, we're going to see how Jesus crushed the things that would crush us. Today, temptation is crushed by Christ's own obedience. Temptation is a new option for evil that presents itself in this world. Evil that becomes an inner conflict over whether we follow the path of wrong or stay on the path of right. Evil, when we fall into temptation, then has a side effect, a crushing sense in ourselves. Our conscience condemns us after temptation claims us. Sometimes the crushing consequences of temptation aren't just in us, but they ruin things around us in a life-changing sin. Some things break that we can't put back together. And then people around us also can feel the consequences of our wrong choices through grief or broken relationships, bad things that they feel because of bad choices that we've made. Today I want to talk about how Jesus crushes the power of temptation. But I want to talk about it not as we're looking at temptation, where we could simply agree to do better in our choices and our actions. Instead, I want to talk about what might be just as dangerous for the committed Christian, the conscientious Christian. I want to focus on post-temptation guilt. To do that, let's meet Jesus as our great high priest, which is a role described in Hebrews chapter 4. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. In these verses, Jesus is presented to us as a high priest who is the solution to these moral conflicts that rage in us and that cause guilt when we lose them. We read about conflicts today in our church service when we read about Jesus in the wilderness for 40 days, tempted by Satan and in conflict with him. We read about David and Goliath, the little good versus the big evil. But in this message, when we talk about how Jesus crushes temptation for us, we won't talk about him as some sort of soldier or as a general. Today I want to talk about Jesus as the great high priest. Now, what is the role of a high priest? A high priest isn't common in American culture, where I'm speaking from, but it was part of the Jewish church in the Old Testament days prior to the arrival of Jesus. So to compare what the role of a priest would be today, I'd like to tell you a story about a car accident a family member of mine was involved in. The cars were crushed. Well, they weren't crushed all that bad. The cars collided. Well, they didn't actually really collide. Basically, one was rolling and it nudged the bumper of the one in front of it at a stoplight. What happened next, though, was pretty scary for me. We received sometime later a letter from a lawyer who said that we were being sued for $150,000, and it would be wise of me to settle, because wouldn't it be a shame to have to put one of my children involved in the accident through the trauma of being tried in court for the accident? That's pretty distressing. I didn't have that money. But I appreciated the work of our insurance company, because a fraud prevention specialist contacted us and said, we know this guy. We know this chiropractor, we know this hospital, and we know this lawyer. And we fought against them before in fraudulent accident claims. So this fraud prevention specialist stood in the gap between me and my family and the threat of a frivolous lawsuit that was aimed at us. She was our great high priest, you might say, the go-between that kept us protected from the threat. It's so good to have a go-between, someone defending us when our sin nature leads us into temptation and the guilt or regret or grief that comes after the wrong choices. It's so good to know that God cares about us, because when we go through this world, it's easy to think that God doesn't really know how difficult this is, life on earth, or constantly trying to keep our minds or our words or actions where they are. But Hebrews chapter 4, we are reminded that God does know the difficulty of life in this world. He says, we have a high priest who has been tempted in every way, just as we are. So if you have had to wrestle with some difficult impulses in your body, some difficult emotions in your mind, if you found it difficult to restrain or control yourself, to be self-disciplined and gracious, and instead chosen wrong words and wrong actions, God knows the struggle. He also cares about us in those struggling moments. We can think that because we have temptation and we're not immediately purified from it, that maybe God doesn't care if I struggle. Why doesn't he just take away my capacity for wrong? Why doesn't he just solve the habitual sin that arises in me, the things that I do wrong again over time? Maybe God doesn't care if I struggle. But in Hebrews chapter 4, we heard the words, we have a high priest who is able to empathize. Jesus knows what it's like to be presented with a split in the road, where there is a choice that may seem appealing and a choice that may seem hard, but that one's wrong and this one's right. We're told that Jesus can empathize with the difficulty of needing to fight against wrong opportunities. But I think the most powerful thing about knowing Jesus is not just in the moment of temptation, but really when our sin nature leads us into temptation. And for the conscientious Christian, not a rookie, not someone a beginner to the faith who can kind of claim innocence or beginner's luck, but for the well-informed, many years or maybe even a lifetime as a follower of Jesus, we get this frustration when we fall into temptation and we know better. We're not, oh, I didn't know that was wrong, but we're so well informed about God's expectations. And when we find ourselves committing wrong or doing things we regret, especially in habitual pattern, we can become so aware of our repeated sin that we might feel that I've just exhausted God's patience. Maybe I could have asked him to forgive me of that the first 12 times, but now that it's time 13, I just don't think I can go to God again. To this, the book of Hebrews has so much comfort for the conscientious Christian crushed by the guilt that follows temptation. We're told, let us hold firmly to the faith that we profess. To profess is to make a claim about something, to state it. We state that Jesus came into the world not to condemn us, but to save us. We state that in Jesus, God's mercies are new every morning. because he gave his life on the cross. Payment has been made, full payment for your wrongs and mine. And that's what we profess, but in the post-temptation moments of guilt or regret or the fallout, the grief, it's hard to believe what we profess, that Jesus would forgive me again. This writer to the Hebrews says, what you say about Jesus forgiving, hold firmly onto it. Hold firmly to that faith, that confidence that we talk about in the Christian church. Have confidence in Jesus' role. You see, Jesus ascended into heaven where he is our great high priest, our defender. So let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence. That phrase, throne of grace, is so surprising. In our culture here in America, there's a famous book by George R.R. Martin, part of a series. It's called A Song of Ice and Fire, which was made into a TV series called Game of Thrones. One of the points of focus in this series is the throne of the ruler of the seven kingdoms that's made out of the weapons of the people he conquered, an intimidating throne. It might remind us of the historical throne of great King Solomon, which was described in this way. Solomon made a great throne covered with ivory, overlaid with fine gold. On both sides of the seat were armrests, with a lion standing beside each of them. 12 lions stood on the 6 steps, one at either end of each step. Nothing like it had ever been made for any other kingdom. These are the way thrones are usually meant to function, a projection of power. Now, you might have a colorful scene like this, but to station a den of lions around your throne, remember that in Solomon's time, the lion would have been the apex predator, the greatest threat in the natural world, the beast, the king of the kingdoms of the animals. To walk into the presence of that throne would be to walk into the den of lions, all of them standing aside this throne of Solomon, projecting his power as the ultimate ruler of the kingdom. The apex predator is the lion. But in Hebrews 4, we were told, let us then approach God's throne of grace. When we approach God's throne, the throne of our Savior, we meet him not as the apex predator of justice, but as the apex priest of mercy, the one whose heart is on the job of defending. Instead of crushing us, Jesus crushes temptation in our place. We care about Jesus, the great high priest, because he came to earth to do what we couldn't. He stood against the pull of evil, even when it was hard, even when it was appealing, and he pushed it back using the words of God, the promises. He had a pure heart that we don't have. Jesus actively obeyed God's moral laws in our place. So as our representative then, he has a pure and holy status before the Heavenly Father that stands in front of us and gives us that same status too as we put our trust in him. So instead of crushing us after we fall into temptation, Jesus crushes temptations in our place. Just like young David, as he stood against that giant Goliath, protected his entire nation by crushing the giant. So Jesus protects his people by standing against Satan, the accuser. So how powerful is Jesus as our high priest? It's an important question because depending on how well he carries out his job as our priest, that's the determining factor about how safe you are from the condemnation of your sin guilt or the accountability for your moral failures. How safe are you really? As an analogy, I'd like to use an event from world news recently. There's conflict in Europe, a war, and in March of 2022, a nuclear power plant in Ukraine came under enemy artillery fire. It was a quite scary moment as you wondered what is going to happen at this nuclear power plant if the wrong thing gets hit. So you start to wonder, well, how fragile is this nuclear power plant? Experts talk about the way these power plants are just built in modern day to survive an impact. Even if you fly a fighter jet into them at 500 miles an hour, the strength of these reactor walls are just incredible. Here's a video of what happens when an F-4 Phantom is accelerated to 500 miles per hour on a sled at the concrete defensive wall of a nuclear reactor. If you understand Jesus in his role as great high priest, then I hope you can connect the dots and answer this question. Where are you in this picture?